Good morning, Western Civ 1. We have gotten up to the 900s in Western Europe in our lecture. We have the establishment of feudalism. That is the relationship of the people involved, lords and their vassals. And manorialism, the lord of a manor and his serfs, or sometimes free peasants there. There are small towns, really nothing you and I would recognize as a city in all of Western Europe. Even Rome, which in 100 AD had 1 million people, probably had fewer than 50,000 people living in it then. The great cities of the future, London, perhaps 30,000 people living there. That is smaller than Bedford or Hurst, if you live in this area today. Paris, even smaller than that. And a lot of the places that would have been on maps as towns of importance were actually 5,000 people or less. In fact, in England, France, Germany, 5,000 people would have been the big city to most people in the year 900. A very big city, as a matter of fact. To most people. The size of 30,000 people in London just left people agog at the time. So this is a very rural society, overwhelmingly rural. But the towns are there, and they've been getting city charters. They begin to get city charters from the kings around the year 900. Now these charters would give them permission to start a market. A place where people could come from all over their area and set up stalls and sell things, and people from all the surrounding countryside could come. These places are really more like Trader's Village in Arlington or something than a shopping mall for us today. They were temporary affairs that merchants would come and set them up for a week or less. But the kings liked these markets because you could levy a tax on a city. And the cities liked these markets because they brought all these visitors who spent money there, right? And the merchants liked these things because you could move from one town to the next once they got these charters, stay on the road and sell, maybe not year-round, but a good part of the year, to much bigger crowds than you ever would in any one town. So this was a win all around for pretty much everybody, and the kings quickly began giving charters to towns, making them officially royal cities. They got to hold a market. But one of the other things that became customary was city air makes free. The cities, the newborn cities, the borning cities, wanted populations, of course. And the way they got these people was by dipping into the manors. So one of the things that would be in these charters, the kings would say anybody who was a resident in the city for 1 year and a day, 1 day over a year, was a free person. No matter what their previous condition had been, if they had lived unmolested by their old lord for 1 year and a day, they were free from any obligations as a serf or even as a slave. This meant if lords of manors wanted their serfs to stay put, they needed a kind of police force, detectives, to go into the nearby towns and track down their runaway serfs and drag them back. The serfs were not slaves, as we talked about. They were free to an extent, but they were not free to leave. They were not free to marry without the Lord's consent. They had to live up to their serfly manorial obligations. And running away was not living up to them. But if you could pull it off, live in a city with a charter for 1 year and a day, you're a free man or free woman. And no lord had control over you then. We'll talk more about life in the cities down the road. But the years 900 to 1000 AD in Europe would see some very important changes. One of them was actually climactic, the climate. We're now much discussing how global climates change. Certainly nobody could say in the 900s and thousands AD that humans were affecting the climate at all. So that wasn't part of the discussion. But even people at that time, which did not have, of course, anything like accurate weather records. They didn't have anything like our thermometer or wind speed indicator. But there were chronicles, people who could keep track of when the last frost was. Sometimes monks did this sort of thing. What was the deepest snow they had that year? When did the harvest come in? Those kind of things could be kept by monastic chroniclers. So our historians can go back and try to reconstruct climate by looking at things like that. When was the deepest snow? When was the last frost? When did the harvest come in? And what you find is as you approach the year 1000, it seems pretty clear that Europe was getting a bit warmer. Year compared to year, the last frost came earlier. The spring began with more rain, and the harvest came in earlier. So much so in some places they could even get 2 crops in before winter set in. They could plant, harvest, even get a second crop in. Now that was not normal for them. So this has become referred to as the medieval warming period. Warmer and a bit wetter than life had been for them around the year 1000. And that, of course, means more food could be grown. More food meant food was cheaper. Cheaper food meant people could eat better for longer. Eating better for longer means you're healthier, more disease resistant, and fewer people die. Especially fewer children die. And we've talked about this, friends. I want to remind you that in the world before our modern period, it was not at all uncommon for a third or more of children to die before they saw their 5th birthday. But in this period, the infant mortality rate began to decline. And that seems to have been primarily because there was more food and therefore less expensive food to be had. Certainly no massive advances in medicine or anything like that, but people simply ate better and lived longer. And children did not die at the same high rate they had. The consequence of that is population starts to grow. Population starts to grow. And as population starts to grow, more people start sneaking away from their manor farms and moving to cities, and the cities begin to grow. So the period of about 1000 on actually is a prosperous period compared to what has gone before it. And this will have all kinds of spillover effects. As people live in cities, you get more diversification in employment. You get division of labor becomes even more divided. Fewer people are full-time farmers, meaning more people have time to develop the arts of civilized life in the cities. So the thousands will become known as the Ottonian Renaissance. It's called that because the men who came up as emperors again, Charlemagne's sons, the empire had kind of fallen into a bit of a chaos. In the late 900s, another German royal family will take the imperial title, and the first 3 of them were Otto the First, Otto the Second, and Otto the Third. So in the late 900s and thousands, you have the Ottonian period in Central Europe, and there will even be what's called an Ottonian Renaissance. As these cities, more people are doing art and architecture in interesting ways. The economy is, well, booming is too strong a word, but it is much more diverse, much more prosperous than it had been 150 years earlier. And at root, part of this is the climate was more favorable for growing food. But something else happens at right around this time. 2 other things become normal in Western Europe, which again are going to produce a great deal more food. So it's not just climate. One of those is the discovery of what's called 3-crop rotation. 3-crop rotation. as you plant on a piece of land, year after year, the same crops, those plants, whatever that crop is, wheat, they want to leach out the minerals and nutrients from that soil that a wheat plant likes. And of course, when you harvest the wheat plant, you carry the straw somewhere else, animals eat it and drop their dung somewhere else, people eat it, they go out, the nutrients leave the soil with the plant being harvested and carried away, all right? And if you plant the same plant on the same ground year after year after year, it is going to strip out those crucial nutrients that kind of plant likes. Makes sense? So over a period of years, the yield of that plant you get is going to go down on that field. What had given you a bumper crop of wheat, 10 years later gives you a mediocre crop of wheat, and 20 years later may give you barely any wheat to harvest at all. It's not that you're doing something wrong, except you're planting the same thing in the same field. Around the year 1000, Western Europeans began to crack this code. And they realized you could break that cycle of downward leaching out of what the plants need there if you rotated crops through. And in fact, some crops even restored some of the crucial nutrients. Let's say what you want is wheat or barley, the kind of things people ate. If you planted that one year and then planted turnips in the same field the next year, the turnips actually restore things to the soil that wheat plants want. So wheat, next year plant turnips there. And then the third year you let the field lie fallow. You don't plant a crop there at all. Now Mother Nature is going to cause some natural grasses to come up there. Send your animals to graze on that piece of fallow land. They will drop their droppings there, a natural fertilizer. So by the time the fourth year rolls around, you can have wheat in that field again, and it will grow very well. So 3 crop rotations was called. A lot of places, the third year was actually a fallow year, but in some other places, they came up with a different kind of crop yet again to put in the field. So you're rotating 3 crops through the same piece of land, or it could be 2 crops in a fallow year. That's if you're prosperous enough, you can let land be not very productive at all, just sitting there untouched for a year. A lot of places you needed something on that could be useful. So they might have a 3rd crop of a different kind yet again. But this 3 crop rotation really helped to increase food supplies and therefore population growth. The other game changer was the development of a very humble piece of technology that it might shock you to know had never been discovered yet: the horse collar. Now, in antiquity, people did use horses for like light chariots. I know you've seen warriors riding in a light chariot with a horse. But that's the most you could do, was a very light, kind of sports car-y kind of vehicle, because nothing heavier could really work. That's why when you saw Ben-Hur, they had 6 horses pulling that little chariot. It wasn't just for speed. It's that you couldn't carry heavy loads with 1 horse. Because if you tried to strap them in, it would choke the horse. The horse could die. They're certainly not going to pull very hard if it's choking them, right? So for heavy plowing in the dense, rich fields of Northern Europe, all plowing of fields until the year 1000 or so was done with oxen, teams of oxen that you could put big heavy wooden yokes on them. They're big burly animals, they have no problem. They're not going to choke. They're strong as an ox, right? But the problem is the oxen, A, they eat a lot, but B, they're very unwieldy animals. And like I said, you had to turn them, you had to turn the whole big thing. It was a big deal. Around the year 1000, the horse collar was invented. And this rested around the horse's entire shoulders and neck. Not down around their throat, but up on their shoulders. And when the horse was put in the collar, you attached what you're making it pull to the collar. And since the weight is on the horse's shoulders, it doesn't choke him. So you could use horses to start plowing fields for the first time in history around the year 1000. That technology will spread, and pretty soon they're using horses to pull all kinds of things. Better, much more convenient than oxen and stronger than donkeys and mules. Mules have their advantages, but these kind of things. The horse now could be used to plow fields. That was another game changer. So by the year 1100, Western Europe is relatively awash in food, and the population is going up like a rocket. By the early 1300s, the population of Europe may have doubled from where it was in 900. So that's very important for understanding the development of civilization. Some of it's climatic, some of it's technological, learning how to do things, developing new inventions. But the result was the growth of cities, bigger populations in general. Food could be produced in greater quantities than ever before by 1300. Then a couple of disasters going to strike. The 1300s have been called a calamitous century by one important historian. We'll get to that later. Got a couple of more lectures between now and then. Take care, friends.